Hey everybody, I just wanted to make a quick video to break down some of the basics from my last article that I posted on Substack. It's called From Dachau to Baltimore, and it explains some various connections and links between the modern psychedelic field and a bunch of Nazi drug experiments that were going on in World War II. And again, I'm going to keep it real basic here. There's a lot more information. If you want to learn more, you can always just head over to the article on my Substack. Alright, so let's get to it. Basically, there were a bunch of drug experiments that went on in the concentration camps built by the Nazis in World War II. These involved a variety of different drugs, including mescaline, opioids, barbiturates, and more. Oh, and scopolamine. Now, a lot of this early work was done to try to find a drug that could be used as a truth serum or to aid the interrogation process, but it seems that they may have had other goals in mind as well. A nurse that was involved in the mescaline experiments at Dachau would later say that the people who were overseeing the research were hoping to, quote, eliminate the will of the person examined, end quote. In these experiments, the drugs were administered to people both without their consent and without their knowledge. A bunch of the Nazis who were involved in those experiments were hired by the US after the end of the war to continue their research on behalf of the US government. But before we get to that, I just want to note another thing that was going on at Dachau, which is the Nazis had actually built an herbal plantation there. It was made on the order of Heinrich Himmler, who was the top commander of the SS. They hoped that the herbal plantation would function as a hub for the German drug market. It was also powered by the forced labor of the people who were imprisoned at the concentration camps. I think this is interesting because it has some parallels to what the US government would do after the war, but we'll get to that in a moment. In addition to the concentration camps at Dachau and Auschwitz, there were also mescaline experiments and even another Nazi herb plantation in Ukraine. Much of the Nazis' drug research was overseen by a company named IG Farben. The legal affairs at IG Farben were handled in part by a New York-based law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. Among the folks at Sullivan and Cromwell who managed IG Farben's business were the Dulles brothers, Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles, both of whom would go on to assume top positions in the US government after the war. Alan Dulles became the director of the CIA, and his brother John became the Secretary of State. And something else happened after the war, which is that the US military hired the same Nazi scientists who had been carrying out the drug experiments at the concentration camps to continue their work for the US. One of the very first projects that happened as part of this process was called Project Chatter, and it was run by the Navy at a research facility just outside of Washington, D.C. Project Chatter focused on mescaline, but it also involved some other drugs as well, and it was overseen by Henry Beecher and Charles Savage. Now, Savage has some interesting connections. For example, he worked with William Richards in Maryland, but we'll get back to that in just a moment. First, I want to explore a couple other things that were happening in the years following the war. Project Chatter was launched in 1947, and that same year, a chemistry professor at Johns Hopkins University, Alsoph Corwin, urged the military to develop drugs which could cause, quote, mass hallucinations and uncontrolled hysteria. And just a couple years later, in 1949, the Army released a special report that laid out the vision for various developments that were in progress. It was written by L. Wilson Green and was titled Psychochemical Warfare, a New Concept of War. And in this report, Green called for the development of a drug that could be used to, quote, incapacitate without killing. In between Corwin's urging the military to develop a drug that could cause mass hallucinations and Green's report that called for drugs that could incapacitate without killing, something else happened in Switzerland that deeply impacted the course that this research took going forward. So among the US military personnel who were involved in the recruitment of Nazis after the war was a general named Charles Lukes. He was a chemical warfare officer for the Army, and he was responsible for monitoring the development of chemical weapons in Europe. As part of this work, he met and became acquainted with Richard Kuhn. Kuhn was a chemical weapons specialist for the Nazis. There's some more stuff about his life that I include in the article, but the main thing of interest for us right now is that he worked for IG Farben and was an advisor to the company. Now, Kuhn's expertise in chemical weapons proved incredibly helpful for Lukes. When Kuhn learned that the US was looking for drugs that could be used for tactical purposes, he told Lukes about a drug that had been developed a few years prior by a Swiss chemical firm. The drug was LSD. The chemical firm was Sandoz. Kuhn referred Lukes to Werner Stoll to learn more about LSD. Werner Stoll had written the first scholarly article about it that was ever published, and he was colleagues with Albert Hofmann, the chemist who invented it. Werner's father, Arthur, ran the pharmaceutical division at Sandoz and was himself an expert in the class of compounds that acid belonged to. In December 1948, on Kuhn's recommendation, Lukes took a train to meet Werner Stoll in Switzerland. As Annie Jacobson explains in her 2014 book, Operation Paperclip, which is great, by the way. If anyone is interested in this, definitely go check it out. This information about Lukes' visit to Switzerland was not officially documented in military records. Instead, it was uncovered by Jacobson in the personal diaries of Luke's, which are archived in Pennsylvania. This meeting in 1948, in my opinion, is particularly noteworthy because, as far as I can tell, this is the earliest point at which the US government became aware of LSD. I've read a bunch of books on acid, and there are some that talk about the Nazi connection, but I haven't seen any that actually incorporate this meeting in 1948. So I think that Annie Jacobson deserves huge props for finding this, and I really hope this adds to the collective conversation about the history of LSD. It's also kind of a key point in this story because, of course, LSD would then become a major focus for US military research in the following years. Now, LSD had already been around for 10 years when Luke's met Werner Stoll. It was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1938 while he was developing a series of drugs for Sandoz. Sandoz, at the time, was part of the quadripartite cartel, a massive European chemical cartel that dominated the continent's drug industry for the few years that it existed, which was from 1929 to 1939. The cartel consisted of IG Farben, Sandoz, and a handful of other European pharmaceutical brands. Now, as I already mentioned, Alan Dulles helped handle the legal affairs for IG Farben through Sullivan and Cromwell. During the war, Dulles also had a position at the OSS, and interestingly, as part of his position at the OSS, he worked in Switzerland. David Talbot, in his book The Devil's Chessboard, writes that Dulles used his time in Switzerland on post for the OSS to tend to his affairs with IG Farben. And he said that Dulles actually helped destroy incriminating documents of IG Farben's work with the Nazis, as they could tell that the war was coming to an end. After the war, Dulles helped co-author the National Security Act, which established not only the Department of Defense, but also the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, of which Dulles himself would become the director just a few years later. The same year that Dulles became the director of the CIA, in 1953, the agency launched MK-Ultra, which I'm guessing needs no introduction, especially if you're watching this video. Now, the quadripartite cartel had dissolved by the time that MK-Ultra began, but the same Nazis who had overseen a lot of the research for IG Farben were now working for Dulles to develop chemical weapons for the US. And as I just mentioned, it was Kuhn, who worked for IG Farben, who was, as far as I can tell, the person who first told the US military about LSD, which very soon became part of this research, which itself had already included mescaline and would soon come to include psilocybin and more. I also want to note real quick, there are some claims that Albert Hofmann belonged to some sort of secretive group that had an interest in the use of acid. That whole thing is the subject of heated debate among drug historians right now, and I think I'm actually going to revisit it in a different video, but I wanted to add it here because it helps inform our context for this whole period and what may or may not have been a part of the history of LSD. There is also a connection to Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, but that's another really big topic that is worth its own video, I think. The main point here with Carl Jung is that one of his followers would take up a student after the war who then became very heavily involved in LSD therapy. That guy was named Hans Karl Leuner, and he would personally oversee over 1,000 LSD sessions in the late 50s. And soon thereafter, Leuner himself took on a student named William Richards, who would become a pretty central figure in the psychedelic field, and who I mentioned earlier in the video also worked with Charles Savage in Maryland. There's even more connections between Hans Karl Leuner, who actually fought for the Nazis in World War II, and another Nazi, and a bunch more stuff that if you find all of this interesting, I encourage you to go check out the piece on my Substack. But I want to keep moving on for the sake of time. So, I already mentioned how the CIA had become a conduit through which a lot of the drug experiments that were carried out for the US were done in the post-war years. Drugs were tested at places like Camp King in Germany, as well as Camp Dietrich and Edgewood Arsenal, both in Maryland, for the various programs that the agency and the military were running at the time. Acid was just one of many drugs that were being used in these programs, although it did emerge as a favorite pretty quickly. But some other drugs that the CIA and the military were looking at in this time include weed, coke, heroin, amphetamines, including MDMA, as well as PCP, mescaline, DMT, Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and a bunch more. The drugs came from various places. For example, the Army would receive drugs that had been developed by pharmaceutical companies that were rejected due to adverse effects, and the botanical and the fungal substances that were more difficult to obtain were gathered by Fritz Hoffmann, who was yet another German scientist who had been hired by the US. Fritz Hoffmann, not to be confused with and of no relation to Albert Hofmann, had worked in a chemical weapons lab for Germany during the war, and he came to the US in 1947, the same year that the CIA was launched, and he began to make chemical weapons for the US. He worked primarily at Edgewood Arsenal, but he traveled all over the world, as mentioned, to gather drugs for the agency. Fritz Hoffmann worked closely with Green, who wrote the psychochemical warfare report that I mentioned, and Hoffmann helped Green find and develop various drugs that could be used for the tactical uses he outlined in the report. He traveled all over the world to do this and collected a variety of drugs and plants, including DMT containing epina, Amanita muscaria mushrooms, peyote, and more. He wrote a report on his research that came to be known as the Hoffman Trip Report. It was published in 1959 and documented the compounds that he worked on at Edgewood Arsenal. Not long thereafter, the CIA oversaw the creation of a new private company to continue searching for drugs in the Amazon. It was called the Amazon Natural Drug Company. It was run by a longtime CIA operative named J.C. King, who managed a crew of indigenous Amazonian people who were teamed up with botanists and then collected various plants that were used to make not only ayahuasca but other drugs, which were then brought back all for the agency to study. Fritz Hoffman passed away under mysterious circumstances in 1966, which led his wife and daughter to suspect that the CIA may have killed him out of concern that he would leak sensitive information. Anywho, the same year that Fritz Hoffman passed away, another scientist who worked at Edgewood with him, Solomon Snyder, joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He would later become the namesake of the school's neuroscience department. As a lot of folks will already probably be aware, Hopkins is home to one of the largest and longest running psychedelic research programs in the US. What some folks may not know is that years before their famous psilocybin program launched, Hopkins had actually been the site of a number of CIA-funded drug experiments. The psilocybin project was conceived in the 90s by Bob Jesse, who had input from William Richards and a bunch of others. To make it happen, he founded a nonprofit called the Council on Spiritual Practices, or the CSP, while on leave from his position at Oracle, which was a technology firm that had originally been launched to serve the CIA. Bob Jesse used the Council on Spiritual Practices as the conduit through which much of the foundational psilocybin research at Hopkins in the early 2000s was arranged and funded. Now, William Richards, who I just mentioned, he already had years of experience administering psychedelic therapy, much of which had occurred during his time at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, or the MPRC, where he worked with Charles Savage, the same chemist who had overseen the mescaline program for the Navy. It's also worth noting that John Lilly, the famous ketamine advocate, who had himself consulted for the CIA, also worked at the MPRC in the same period. The CIA, of course, was behind a lot of the LSD research in the 50s and the 60s. In fact, they even contracted the pharmaceutical company, Eli Lilly, to produce nearly $500,000 worth of acid to use for their experiments. The chemist at Eli Lilly who oversaw the synthesis of the LSD for the CIA was Ed Cornfield, who himself would later become personally acquainted with a younger chemist named David Nichols. Like William Richards, David Nichols would later become a central figure in the field. He has synthesized not only psilocybin for Hopkins, but also MDMA for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, as well as DMT for Rick Strassman's groundbreaking DMT research. Nichols has also synthesized LSD and various analogs of it. Now, there is a lot more I could talk about here, but I want to keep it as concise as possible today, so there's just one more thing that I want to discuss and then we'll wrap up the video. That is the various links between MAPS and a handful of pharmaceutical companies that I think are interesting, two of which actually were part of the quadripartite cartel in the 30s. So, as mentioned, the company that Albert Hofmann worked for when he made acid was Sandoz. Now, currently, the chairman of the board of directors at the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation is Jeff George, who, prior to joining MAPS, was the CEO of Sandoz. MAPS also employs a team of folks who previously worked together at Novartis, which actually owned Sandoz until a recent spin-off. Novartis had been formed from a merger of Sandoz and Ciba-Geigy. Now, Geigy, along with Sandoz, both belonged to the quadripartite cartel in the 30s. And there's another link to Ciba that's interesting, but it's just too much, so we'll get into that for another video. Anyway, I just find it interesting that MAPS has so many links to these companies. As I already said, there is a whole lot more that I can get into here, but I want to keep it brief, so we'll cut it there. I'm going to leave you with this chart I made that outlines the links that I explained in this video. Now, I'm not trying to allege anything with this chart other than the fact that there are documented links between these people and organizations. That is all. Make of it what you will. So hopefully this video has been interesting. I really appreciate you all taking the time to watch. If you want to learn more, just go to my Substack to read the full piece. All of this and much more is going to be part of my new book, High and Mighty, How People in Power Use Drugs, which is going to drop soon. That's it for now. Thanks.